We'll start our first presentation in just a minute. As you'll notice, if you looked at the schedule, we've adjusted it. We've changed it, let's say. Mike is giving his talk on frequency. The guy who talks FM all the time. Frequency modulation is going to start in just a minute. And Randy Warren will give his talk on assembling a budget hi-fi system with vintage components. And Randy's been giving a talk almost every year for a few years now, and he talks about turntables and amplifiers and more vintage hi-fi stuff than antique radios. And his seminars are really popular. So I highly recommend that this afternoon. We had to switch them because Randy has a gig with his rock and roll band tonight. So we had to let him get out soon enough. And his talk will be at 1:30. And then we'll have Paul Hart about acquiring and maintaining a tube tester in today's environment. He will be at 3 o'clock. And Paul's talks are really good too. If there's anything you ever want to know about tube testers, ask Paul because he knows. And if you've ever made a mistake, he can unmake it for you maybe. And he'll have some really good advice on how to get a tester and keep it working, because some work better and stay running better than others. And just a reminder, tomorrow, and then we have our banquet tonight. There may be some tickets left. I don't know, I haven't checked. But that will be a good dinner and a good talk by Ed Lyon, who will talk about electronics from Washington's own Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of activity in electronics here over the years, not just in the military industrial zone, but also in commercial electronics. And then tomorrow we have a walk-around auction at 8:30, and the auctioneer will do all the areas, the inside in the gym, the patio, and out in the parking lot. And the big auction will be in the afternoon. Consignment will start in the gym, on that side of the gym. And please bring your things in from the rear entrance. You can drive around and just walk in the door, and you're right in the consignment area there. And then the auction itself will start at noon, and we'll have another talk by Ed Lyon. His very popular every year is Radio Repair Clinic. That will be at 9:30. The Old Equipment Contest judges are in the Old Equipment Contest room right now, judging the Old Equipment Contest entries. And it's cordoned off so that they can have privacy and settled area and not have you looking over their shoulders while they're writing their critiques on the various items. That will be open to reviewing at 2:30. 2:30 to 3 we have on the schedule. And again, this evening after the banquet, they will be open. And if you have items in there, please remove them at the end of the evening, because tomorrow morning we'll use that same area for the consignment for the auction. So now Mike Molnar is going to talk about the development of wideband FM. Since 1902 is his claim. Mike has been involved with radio and electronics for 40 or 45 years. He says he used to have a Zenith dealership himself and was doing repair on Zenith equipment until they went bankrupt, and then he had to do something else. So he figured his Zenith background would be good, so he went into nuclear medicine. Go figure. Who knows where your radio interests will take you. So with no further ado, let's please give a nice hand for Mike.
Thanks, everybody. I did want to say I really enjoyed last night's presentation on boxo tubes. I didn't stay till the end, so I don't know who won, but it was a tough fight. But anyway, the history of FM from 1902. when I'm demonstrating some of the sounds coming from early 1920s radios, that when people come to my home, I get a lot of comments like, why would anyone listen to this noise? And my answer is because it's so much better than no radio. It's all they had back then. And of course, every once in a while I get the wise guy kid that'll say, well, why didn't they just use their phones? But we only had the AM radio, and it had its problems. And some even thought, as they would develop things, that maybe a radio with a lot more dials would be better. But they still didn't get too far with that. And when I started to think about how FM came to be, I found that pretty much what I knew came from these books about Armstrong, the Man of High Fidelity, both the hardcover and later the softcover. So from that you get that who could the radio fan turn to improve the radio sound coming into their living room? If anyone could, it would have been Howard Armstrong. He was already world famous for the regenerative circuit, the super hat, and other improvements that he made to radio, then the super regenerative. So again, most of the knowledge I had about that came from this Lawrence Lessing biography. And then I looked at, well, what is it that I know, or believe I know? That I believe that Armstrong conceived the theory of FM, that it was intended to improve audio quality, that he received no help from RCA. Nobody else worked on FM, if you just read that book. And instantly, once this discovery came, that all of the benefits of FM were revealed. And that Sarnoff fought the idea only for financial reasons, and how Armstrong's fight to defend FM led to his suicide. But as I learned more and more about it, I found that mostly what I saw on this list, I pretty much had all wrong. As I found out that the first patent for an FM system was filed in 1902 and granted in 1905 by this Cornelius Ehret. And it's hard to know some of the symbols they were using, but you could see he's generating a continuous wave up on top, and has a lot of capacitor kind of things in there to vary the frequency. And in his description, he says it comprises further a method of modifying and varying the frequency of the electroradiant energy in a manner corresponding in accordance with the signal to be transmitted. And it also has the further step of transmitting and receiving in accordance with sound waves such as speech. So even though they didn't have the, 1902 is just a year after Marconi sends an S across the Atlantic, so he didn't have the equipment to actually build it, but it was plausible enough that he was awarded a patent for it. Another early use for modifying the signal by the frequency was by Polson, who invented the arc transmitter. They used a system, since the continuous wave telegraphy they were trying to do wasn't very readable, they came up with an idea called frequency shift keying. So this isn't something for voice, but what they came up with was a scheme where every time you would be transmitting a continuous wave on one frequency, and every time you keyed it would shift to another frequency. So the transmitter would be sending a continuous wave at frequency number 1, and then as the operator keys the transmitter, it shifts from F1 to F2, and then the receiver person is only listening to F2, so they hear clear dots and dashes, and then whoever would have been on, if accidentally on F1, would have only heard the time when there's no dots or dashes. They would hear the blank spots and not the actual code coming in. But eventually that didn't prove as effective. They came up with other schemes, so that use of modulating the frequency went away. And then the broadcast era begins, and AM transmitters are pretty much what's going on all around the country. You know, this simple diagram just shows how, as the amplitude rises on the carrier wave that's being sent out. But it had its problems that many of us know about. It was very prone to static, fading, interference, poor fidelity, and later had problems where the broadcast band was being crowded out. So in 1916, Sarnoff was the one who proposed the idea of the radio music box and started all of this thought about home radios. And he went to his engineers, because he was looking at all these problems with AM, and said, what I need is a little black box that I can put between the radio and the listener to get rid of all these problems. So guys, go at it, get me a little black box. And there were also financial reasons, not just to make it easier for the listener. When they did a survey years later, they found that FM radio would give 37 more good reception days when you take away thunderstorms and bad atmosphere, sunspots or whatever, that just by switching to FM, there was a financial reason to want to develop this. And so Armstrong, already famous, this is the lab he worked in with his mentor, Michael Pupin, already a famous inventor in his own right. And they started investigating different methods of filtering static out of radio. But at the time, they couldn't come up with a good answer. So Armstrong takes it on himself that he's going to declare war on static. And he developed a system that wasn't FM, but it was a method of using two transmitters, and somehow the signals would interact, and then you would subtract one from the other, and you'd be left with a clearer signal. But, and they did some demonstrations out in Radio Central, and they did get better results. But at the same time, looking into this for AT&T was their mathematician, John Carson. That's him on the left there. He was a pure mathematician, and he did a lot of work to look at what Armstrong had presented and was able to prove mathematically that it wasn't making any difference. And they came to the conclusion that the only difference was Armstrong built better equipment than RCA had, and that's how they got their improvement. And this really took Armstrong back. I mean, he hadn't had big public failures in his career, and he would later state that it took him years to get back his confidence after that event. So back to the methods of modulating. So it was known that FM existed, obviously, from 1902 and worked by other people. There was also phase modulation, which they knew about, but decided it was not applicable at that time. And then the AM that was already in use. So from the earliest days, they knew that this would be what an FM signal would look like. And in this very basic circuit, this is for narrowband FM. You see, say, the diaphragm of the microphone is what varies the frequency, so that you vary the frequency of the transmitted signal. And there were early researchers in a lot of places coming up with ways to look at narrowband FM. One of the earlier patents went to Frank Conrad. That was his patent in 1926, I think it is. And or this was Don Littles, who worked with Conrad. And this is Conrad's patent from 1925. But then again, along comes this AT&T engineer, Carson, who does another paper that's published in the Proceedings of the IRE, and says it is proved that the frequency modulation system using a spacing or compensating wave is inferior to amplitude modulation system, both in the width of the frequency band that would be occupied and as to distortion of the signal waveform. And every experiment pretty much proved it, although work still went on, and surprisingly, in this earlier time of it, at RCA, because they were trying to still make something with narrowband FM that would increase their coverage and reduce fading. So they were doing tests from Riverhead, Long Island to Bolinas, California, and also out to Hawaii and the Philippines. And some famous engineers at RCA, Harold Beveridge, Murray Crosby, and Clarence Hansel, were putting together a lot of that work out on, at Riverhead, Long Island, and invited Armstrong to come and see what they were working on. And in return, Armstrong invited them back, and he showed them what he was working on. And both were going their own way. And the patent that was awarded to Clarence Hansel in 1928, it shows pretty much system that would look like an FM receiver. Had a different name of a analyzer and detector instead of a discriminator. And they were pretty much on a very similar track, but still with narrowband FM. And I also found out that from 1902 to 1940, there were 120 patents granted on FM systems, and 55 were to RCA, and only 20 were to Armstrong. And Westinghouse 10, Western Electric 6, and 29 to other individuals. But what comes to Armstrong and not giving up on the theory is now that things were developing to where what they called ultra shortwave would be possible, and then there'd be places out there to expand the bandwidth you were going to use. He came up with the idea of wideband FM, because from the simplest explanation, if he was told that narrowband FM couldn't work, well, why can't wideband FM make all of those mathematical problems in Carson's paper just go away? And he had to do a lot of work to make that happen, because they had to develop ultra-high frequency transmitters, receivers, and if you're going to have better audio, you had to have better audio equipment. So he built this. This is the first FM radio made for demonstration purposes in the lab at Columbia University. It was only intended to transmit from one room to the other in the lab. And Armstrong goes to work and secures what he considers 5 patents that would lock the system in, so that someone couldn't come up with a way around his patents. So starting with one that was applied for in 1930, 1927, and finally by December 26th of 33, he's got everything in place and gets awarded the patents to secure his system. So now that he's confident that this is all protected and his rights are protected, he decides it's time to invite Sarnoff and engineers from RCA to see what was being done in the labs. And they were impressed but skeptical. I mean, obviously that didn't look like a radio someone would put in their home. So what Sarnoff agreed to finally do was to let them, when television tests in the Empire State Building were finished, they would let Armstrong use the transmitter, and he'd have to build his own equipment to modulate it, his FM equipment, and run field tests to see what the results would be. So Armstrong begins preparing the equipment and starts to work at it. Now, this is the little bit that was allowed for experimental work by the FCC. Down the 2 black bands, one very down low in that range that became the early FM band, around 42 megahertz or so, and then another little sliver up around 117 megahertz. And this is the, I said RCA's been conducting tests at the Empire State Building. They were using a scanning disk camera and a kinescope receiver to do these tests, and then they concluded their experiments. They had decided that the scanning disk cameras weren't going to do it, so there'd be a time while the iconoscope was being worked on that the system wouldn't be used, and that's when Armstrong came and took over. And if you've seen pictures of the Empire State Building and other tall buildings today, this is the only antennas that were on top of the Empire State Building at the time. And these are the VHF transmitters that NBC had up at the top there at that time. Now, in 1991, Thomas Bolzalski retired chief engineer of the Empire State Transmitter, actually spoke at the AWA conference, and he told of the experience that he and his staff had with working with Armstrong to facilitate all this testing. And he noted, as other people have, that Armstrong didn't work on a regular time clock. He would have an idea and call up and say he's coming, and they would clear the decks for him, and if the work ran late, he would just take everybody out to dinner, tell them stories about the early days of wireless, and everybody had a good time and was glad they stayed to work late. This is the breadboards that were in the other room from those VHF transmitters that modulated the signal, and again, he went with the breadboard so that they could make changes anytime they thought that Armstrong thought something needed to be done differently. And this is more of that equipment. So tests started from the Empire State Building, and it was being received by the only FM transmitter there was, which was in the home of Armstrong's friend George Burgard out on Long Island. And the results were impressive, quality sound even in thunderstorms. And this is the log entry. A lot of this was information was available on an archive that Columbia University keeps. Anyway, W2XD, looks like G, signed off all the tests performed according to Hoyle. This experiment concludes just 20 years of work on this problem. It is with the deepest gratification that I have here that my two oldest friends, George Burkhardt and Randolph Runyon, old-timers who saw the genesis of regeneration, took part in the culmination of this work. An era as new and distinct in the radio art as that of regeneration is now upon us, and after 10 years of eclipse, my star is again rising. Edwin Armstrong. So for a better test, the FM receiver was moved to the basement of Harry Sadenwater's house, another Armstrong friend in Haddonfield, New Jersey. So again, this is the FM receiver. There's a tuning section. Each of those boxes, that I think that's a Radiola 44 cabinet in those, had the IF sections, and then audio was down on the far end on the right. But Armstrong gets notified that television testing is going to resume, and all of his equipment had to be removed. He was, during this time, very concerned that the response from Sarnoff was very lukewarm at best, and finally he couldn't encourage him to let him move on any better, even though he got all these good results. So Armstrong has to decide to go it alone and develop his own commercial FM system. And to do this work, he again turns to some of his old-time friends. Runyon, with his amateur radio station in Yonkers, agrees to let Armstrong modify his equipment so that testing can continue from there and not from the Empire State Building. The archive there actually has the logbook of some of the transmissions they did. And I don't know how big a house he had, but this is the high power multiplier and high power amplifier of W2AXG, the modulators, and they've got it all working. And so Armstrong, up to this point, the only ones who knew about these tests were RCA-related people. So the general radio engineering public didn't know what was going on yet. So Armstrong writes a paper that's published in the Proceedings of the IRE, and at one of their meetings is going to present the paper and give a test reception. He hadn't told anybody that there would actually be a reception of signal from Runyon's transmitter. So there was apparently some stalling because they had some kind of glitch with a cable. So he just stretched out his talk until he got a chance to have everything working. And the silence was broken with this announcement. This is W2A, it should say 2AXG, broadcasting with frequency modulation on 2.5 meters. And the reports are that at that time, just the statement that they were broadcasting a quality signal on 2.5 meters had caused a hush in the crowd, as they said. The rest of the demonstration included music and sound effects, where they would do things like pouring water in a glass and you could clearly hear it, things that just amazed them in the audience. But even with that kind of a demonstration, the thing that kept popping up in everyone's mind is, if there's something to this, why isn't RCA interested in it? They controlled the world of radio. And that would be, we'll see that that's repeated much more in the radio business as time went on. So critics were pointing out the problem with FM being that 27 million radios in use couldn't receive FM. They had that belief that FM would only be line of sight, that so it would have limited range, that they'd never get that big apparatus to work outside the lab, too complicated for home use, too expensive for home use. And again, most serious of all, if RCA wasn't getting into it, there must not be anything to it. So Armstrong purchases land in Alpine, New Jersey to build his FM station. And remarkably, he's denied a license. Now, who could be more qualified to have an experimental radio transmitter? So he actually has to hire a Washington law firm to go to the FCC and demand that he get this license. This is a copy of it from the archive, and even at that point, it's only good for about a month, and he'd have to reapply again to keep working. So this is a picture of the land where the tower is going to be constructed. I don't know how many of you have ever been up in that area, and that tower is still there and still shiny and overlooks the Palisades. And this is what it looked like when they first started clearing the land, construction of the tower starting. And that's the final result of what it looked like back then. And you can see the transmitter building on the bottom. So the Alpine Tower, top of the third arm, 410 feet, next arm 320, then 240, 150 feet across, and almost 1,000 feet above sea level. This is the transmitter building with W2XMN on the doorway. And I couldn't find many pictures of what was inside the building, at least at the time that this was being done. But this cover of FM magazine, November 41, had a picture of the way it looked right then. And this is kind of a rare picture of Armstrong at his desk. World-famous inventor did not exactly make a lavish office for himself, just piles of papers and him on the phone. So as these tests are going to begin, the fact that there was only one FM radio wasn't going to work out too well. So Armstrong contracts with GE to build 25 FM receivers, and GE was going to charge $400 each. When I did the numbers in 2020, it came out to $7,000 a radio, $175,000 in 2020 dollars. And these were called, since GE was up in Schenectady, the Schenectady sets. This is one of the 25 units that was actually in the contest at the Mark meet a few years ago. Some of you may have seen it. This is the interior, 2 chassis, and the lower chassis is the RF and IF section, and the box in the center is a shielded RF module. And there were a lot of tubes in it, and some of the tubes were apparently developed just for this project, probably contributed to the price that GE charged. And I haven't seen other references to these model tubes, ZP333 and 332. And you'll also see on the list there's it had 2 IF sections, the first one at 2 megahertz and the second one at 200 kilohertz. I don't know the reason for that. And of course, GE didn't want to let the fact go by that it also needed some of their patents to build this set. And when I added them up, there's somewhere around 160 patents on the tag in that receiver. And it said, it was evolving into what was more the typical block diagram of a conventional FM receiver. So the timeline of developments in the 30s was from 30 to 33. Armstrong's research brings him to the concept of wideband FM. 33 builds the first prototype and shows it to Sarnoff. 34 to 35, the Empire State Building test. 35, he has to end the test. 36, the disclosure of FM to the radio industry. 37 and 38, the experimental station W2XMN. And what's happened now in 1939 and 40 is that some of the commercial stations are getting their experimental licenses to begin broadcasting in FM. This is the first day of broadcasting at W2XOR, which was the experimental FM station for WOR in New York. And that's Armstrong at the control panel. Got this picture from the Popoli collection. That's Jack Popoli, WOR's chief engineer, standing on the left. He, in his career, he started building the first WOR station in 1922 and retired from WOR for other businesses as they were getting into color television. So he was chief engineer from being the only one in the department to 400 people when he retired, and was a very big proponent of not only FM but anything Armstrong would do. And so experimental stations are on the air, and this is the list that was going by March 15th, 1940. And I just picked one to produce here, but the numbers were changing every month as these authorized for construction names would change to on the air. And the FM band allotment changed, so you can see what was considered the old FM band from 42 to 50 megahertz on the far left there, and still a little notch for experimental up around 117. So in May 1941, then there's actually commercial stations on the air. And they had there's some fights as to who was actually first. The Nashville station claims to be first on the air, but W71NY, which was what W2XOR had become, claims to be the first commercial station on the air because they sold the first ad. And this is from, in the Popoli collection, the advertising rate card for W71NY. So you could get a half hour of advertising on an FM station for $50. And that's a New York station covering the metropolitan area, $100 at night. About these call signs, they had an unusual way of doing it. First, when the experimental phase ended to become a commercial station, they took the X out of the call sign. And this was a little crazy to understand at first, but they also added two numbers to indicate the last two digits of the frequency assigned. So if you look at W71NY at the bottom there, there's an automatic 4 in front of it, and then it became 47.1 was the frequency assigned for W71NY. W51C at the top would be 4 in front of that, so 45.1 megahertz. They got tired of that after a while and thought it was, and they just dropped doing it that way. So now, with enough interest, Armstrong is licensing people and finally generating some amount of income. So for transmitters, REL, Radio Engineering Lab, and General Electric and Western Electric. And for receivers, those are the early believers. Zenith, Stromberg Carlson's in there, GE, Scott, and Pilot, Stuart Warner Ansley. It was all people who built higher-end radios who also wanted to get on the higher-end sound. And also GE, where the 39 World's Fair is noted for the introduction of television, was also a place where GE inaugurated FM by putting in FM radios in their display and having WOR's FM station broadcast directly to them to make demonstrations for the crowd. GE also did tests to determine the coverage of an FM station, and they were very surprised at some of these results. If you look at, the idea was two equally powered stations in the same distance, 15 miles apart, and they found that if you look at the small circle inside, so at the same 1,000 watts, that was the coverage for an AM station, the AM transmitter. When they switched to FM, their coverage went all the way out to the bigger circle. And Armstrong himself takes to the road to demonstrate and promote FM. He had affiliations with the Yankee Network and went on these little demonstration tours. And they had a demonstration van. And the Yankee Network, if some of you don't know, it was started by this John Shepard, and it was a group of New England AM broadcast stations, and he was an early proponent of FM, and would often speak to groups if Armstrong couldn't. And what they did with the a problem for all the stations was, if you try to form a network, was to pay to rent the lines from AT&T. So they made an experiment where they used, made a network of FM broadcasting. So if you look at the top left, the program originates in Yonkers at Runyon's house, goes to the Alpine station, from there is sent, and eventually ends up on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And the quality of the signal, even though these weren't big rebroadcasting transmitters, and it has lists what frequency they were on, gave a quality signal right down to the end, and they were all set to end the need for renting lines. So some of the highlights was again, the Columbia University, Empire State Building, and now these experimental stations and the network. So they found that they were impressed with the results. They've reduced static to being insignificant, eliminating interference by stations on the same frequency, which now in specifications on some FM equipment you'll see listed as a capture effect. They were able to use more of the audio spectrum, dynamic range, and as you would tune across the dial, all the signals came in at the same level, penetrating steel bridges. So at this time, at the same power station, you could see how much extra coverage they would get over a predetermined area. And they were also starting to begin testing with FM multiplexing. This is one of the earlier things on the market was an FM converter. This one's a Scott. So it just has the old FM band, and you could go into an input on one of the big Scott radios. And this is a Stromberg Carlson 505H that I came up with, a 1940 model that just has the old band on it. And this Pilot T301 has both AM and FM, the early band on it. And there were more companies making the converters. Probably you've seen the Howard and the Pilot tuner in these flea markets. An unusual one is the General Electric, which they called an FM translator. And then there's a Meisner made a couple different models too, both in the early band and the late band. But the fight to get commercial FM established to the point it was hard. The fight to keep FM alive was going to be even harder, and the path to a victory in court would be harder, longer, and tragic. In the 1940s, find a rougher road for FM. because of a number of attacks that would come from a number of fronts. And Sarnoff, when he would talk to Armstrong about this, said, you know, you're not giving us something that we can evolve into, that it's a revolution, that we have to throw everything out. But Armstrong was convinced that if it's something better, then you throw everything out and you start over. And the big money was saying that's not going to happen. So the plan was to pretty much delay and deny any development on FM. By 1942, they do have 26 commercial stations on the air. And some of the reasons to delay and deny was not only would the radios become obsolete, but all the broadcast stations would be obsolete. And that's where, as radio evolved, RCA was making more money on the broadcast stations and advertising than they were on making little tabletop radios that had dropped so much in price over the Depression years. So RCA couldn't afford all of that development expense, not only during the Depression, but ultimately because Sarnoff wanted to do nothing that would impede the development of television. He was putting all of his marbles into television. So some of the challenges they faced, besides the competition from television, was an interruption to all work during World War II. And then there were battles over regulations, battles over patents, battles by litigation, and battle of endurance. And we'll look into some of those things. When World War II starts, commercial radio production is stopped, and Edwin Armstrong, always the major, volunteers his efforts and the work of his lab to the war effort. The Army is impressed with the capabilities of FM communication. This, once the military learned about how, with the same amount of power, you had more coverage with FM, and they would also be safe from enemy listeners, that they didn't have FM radios to listen with. Historians have now credited a lot of these mobile devices as the reason that Patton's army was able to move across Europe so rapidly. And they also investigated the idea of FM radar, and they built a system up at the Alpine Tower that's a smaller tower near the big tower, and they had all the equipment racks in the main building. And you can see restricted on some of these. These are from that Armstrong archive, and they actually did range testing and published all the results. Unlike RCA and other companies, Armstrong would never charge for his time or materials even. He felt that it was his duty to do this for the country. And finally, towards the end, was near bankrupt when they pretty much forced him into sending an invoice for at least some of the work he'd done. But the industry's resources, as the war effort was starting to wind down, was going into television. This is, they already had to share revenues with AM radio versus television, and the industry did not want to share FM revenues. They were already beginning field tests. This is a field test receiver in an engineer's home in probably 36 or 7. That's an RR-359 radio, or television rather, the mirror in the lid type. So then, while that was going on, the battle of regulations started. And every time you could almost see in these committee meetings, we're going to do something for the good of FM. So what they came up with for the good of FM was what they called the single market plan. So since FM coverage for the same transmitter power as an AM station would far exceed the geographical area, they thought it would help the FM stations to better program just for their area if they didn't cover that wider area. So therefore, the transmission power of an FM transmitter was reduced to 2,000 watts. So some of these were already running at 40 or 50,000 watts and had to take this big step down. and which also, as their fledgling operations trying to get started, that naturally reduced their advertising revenue when they had to reduce their range by so much. Another regulation they came up with for the good of FM was duplicate programming. So big AM broadcasters in the beginning were forced to also transmit on FM, but they had to come up with different programming. And now, wouldn't it be better for FM if more people had a chance to listen to the same AM programming on FM, therefore giving the big money companies no extra expense to also transmit on FM? And soon it would be when the AM/FM salesman would go in to sell ads, he could throw in FM as a freebie when an FM broadcaster had to come in and charge. So that was a big financial setback for them. Extended hours. For the good of FM, if the hours that were broadcast by these FM stations was extended, more people could enjoy FM and buy more radios. Well, the problem is that wouldn't work because they were already, the broadcasting expenses were as much as they could handle, so to have to add on another 6 hours to get to 12 would put some of them out of business. So originally they only needed to broadcast 6 hours a day, which they could pick for prime time when someone would want to listen to classical music or some special programming. Now they'd have to be on during the day when people didn't have access to their FM radio anyway. So with little change in revenue, they had to double their expenses. And then for the good of FM radio, let's change the frequency that it's on. A big case was made that there's going to be sunspot activity that would interfere with the early FM band. Never proved, just predicted. And after no matter who went to try to fight to change their ideas, the FCC was committed and just went ahead with the change. Armstrong would travel to Washington to speak at these committees with no change in their minds. And this is the Zenith FM transmitter, which was installed in the field building in 1941. So Zenith at the time was using about 50,000 watts. They had a bigger transmitter than the Alpine Tower. And they covered the whole Midwest with an FM signal. And they had made some early FM sets, some of their big consoles, and they were well received. But when they had to do the change down to 2,000 watts, then they just became a Chicago station again. And the other thing that it did to Zenith, the frequency change, was being appealed, and the new models were going to come out. So what Zenith did was they made a few models in a couple of years that covered both the old FM band and the new FM band. And you can see this radio often as just an AM/FM set, but you can see there's the 3 bands on this one. And that's the model 7H820. So the next battle that FM had to fight was over patents. Since RCA held a number of patents, an infringer with say Motorola or Emerson, who were making FM radios without an Armstrong license, would be able to feel protected because RCA had a whole bunch of FM patents too, so let the lawyers fight it all out. And this is some of the ones that are assigned to RCA, different detector designs. The ratio detector was certainly one of the big ones. There's one for a combined FM and AM detector, but the ratio detector was the name given to the one that was used a lot. And what you see in this picture is something that Armstrong did, where the picture on the top is the ratio FM detector as published by RCA, and then on the very bottom is the Armstrong discriminator detector. So not that anyone would have made that first diagram just to obfuscate the situation, but when Armstrong just redrew it, you could see how close the two designs really are. So that's RCA redrawn in the middle and Armstrong on the bottom. And basically, Armstrong's decision was that what they called their super detector or super FM was just his detector without the limiter stage. And he went and spoke his case about that wherever he could. There was also a Philco model that used a FM 1000 tube. It's the only use that I think ever happened for that tube. And there's another design that used a Farnsworth design with a 6S6 tube that was a kind of a weird triple diode and high mu triode tube. And as the litigation went on, these sets were going on the market. But the thing that Armstrong did was he provided these labels for every licensed Armstrong manufacturer to put on the back of their radio. And he published letters, these were in the Jack Popoli collection, that Armstrong sent out to the license holders information that they could pass on to the public about the difference between an Armstrong licensed model and an off-license model. So he even published a list of who was currently licensed so that hopefully say if you were a radio dealer and you were promoting the licensed models, you could show this to a potential buyer. All the efforts by the opponents of FM were starting to have an impact, and the number of licenses in 1949 was the peak as the numbers went down as we get to 1956. And the industry losses, if you were an FM station, weren't published in the beginning years, but you could see that by 1953 through 57 on this, that they were starting to lose a lot of money. This is likely one of the last photos of Howard and Marion Armstrong. Friends and family were beginning to notice the toll the battle was taking on Armstrong, and it was becoming a test of endurance. Armstrong was quoted by a friend as saying that his opponents will fight him on this until he is either dead or broke. And Armstrong is growing weary of, he had around this same time lost the patent battle for regeneration, which if a regenerative circuit technically today was still a DeForest invention, as he lost a Supreme Court appeal. And he was planning, he was so disheartened with the whole business that he was going to return I forget what that medal's called, the Medal of Honor to the Institute of Radio Engineers. And he had prepared this speech that he was going to give. He said, "It's a long time since I've attended a gathering of the engineering and scientific world, a world in which I am at home, one in which men deal with realities, where truth is, in fact, the goal. For the past 10 years, I have been in exile from this world, and an explorer in another world, where men substitute words for realities and then talk about the words. Truth in that world seems merely to be an avowed object. Now I undertook to reconcile the objects of these two worlds, and for a time I believed that could be accomplished. Perhaps I still believe it, or perhaps it's a dream." So, fortunately, the speech was never delivered because the management at the IRE heard what he was planning to do and told him, "We're not going to accept it. You're keeping the medal." So, in an article around that time, written by Carl Dreyer, a radio man and a historian, wrote an article called E. H. Armstrong, the Hero as an Inventor. And he notes, and I had found out in a number of other places, that you couldn't find someone who would be more devoted to a cause as Howard Armstrong. He fought over the regeneration patent it extended into 3 decades. And then he had to somehow come up with all the energy to do the same thing for FM. And Dreher pointed out that beyond a certain point, devotion to a cause, however admirable, enters the realm of pathology. And like I said earlier, that a lot of his friends are already noting this. And by January 31, 54, he's well past that point, and that, as we all know, it ends in suicide. But Armstrong lost his struggle for FM, but FM, the invention, would fight on. This is the closing statement. It was in the archive for when the Alpine station had been reassigned a call sign of KE2XCC, and that they're concluding a special program in memory of Major Edwin H. Armstrong, last program for over 15 years of broadcasting. To our faithful audience of music lovers, we say thanks for your attention and your letters of praise and criticism. Goodbye and good luck. And they pull a switch and salute the memory of Armstrong. But like I said, the FM would live on, and Marion Armstrong takes up the battle. The primary thing of all the money Armstrong had been paid over all the years was his estate consisted of 21 unsettled lawsuits. And many advised her just to take whatever offer just to make the suits go away, but she didn't want to hear that, and took up the cause with this attorney, Dana Raymond, who had been working with Armstrong, who described her as quite a woman. And it took time, but she won every lawsuit, and some of the arguments that were made by companies like Emerson was that if an FM signal is in the air, anyone clever enough to design a way to receive it should be within their rights to do so. And that didn't carry. And with all the patents that RCA had, all the infringers who thought they were protected under RCA licenses, that didn't hold up in court either. And the Armstrong estate wins all the cases. So as time went on, all of these benefits of FM were realized, and FM, the product, did its job and survived all of these battles. And we also see that it moved in the performance that was learned with the military. FM became the way to do police radios. The Link Company did a lot of work in that. Motorola became big in that. And then the hi-fi side started to come along. So lovers of good music discover FM, and hi-fi makes the scene. This is the one of the first models made for home hi-fi use by REL, the precedent. Up to that point, REL had only been manufacturing transmitters, but this mono FM tuner needs 15 tubes to get mono FM, and it's built, they said, to prove the way that Armstrong wanted to do it was absolutely the best. 4 IF amplifiers. And the spec sheet shows that it's comparable to anything that would be on the market now. And other startup companies were getting into the hi-fi world, and this is an early Radio Craftsman that was another one that had a lot of models in that time period. And another thing that I found interesting is some companies to not have to do a lot of engineering to share IF amplifiers or the tuner section would actually make, you could almost see that this is a split chassis down the middle. So the audio output would have been, and the power supplies would have been the only thing in common. And it's basically 2 radios with 2 tuning dials, all packaged in the same box. And another thing that saved FM was the use in car radios. This is the Gonset model 3239 from 1959. So for mounting under a dashboard, and you could see the amount of hardware all jammed into that little box. And Motorola got into the scene. The FM 900, which is installed in the car, would run independent. This didn't go through the AM radio, so you'd have your own speaker and your own. You could actually have the two on at the same time if you wanted to. The interesting thing in their design is that they had the little box on the left is the transistorized audio output stage, and then all jammed inside was the tube section. And this would have been in 1962. So now, what did I learn? The best thing about me doing some of this stuff is that I learn a lot of stuff. And so I had never known that Armstrong had several failures in trying to reduce static. I never knew that many inventors had failures to try to produce narrowband FM, that many worked on FM as early as 1902. And that Armstrong actually did build on the earlier research on FM by RCA and others, but he gets and deserves the sole credit for wideband FM and commercializing it. And that all of these benefits, I didn't find anything that said that he expected all the benefits that he got, like the extended range compared to AM. And that the battle with RCA, since they had all their complications of wanting to have TV developed and put FM on a back burner, is a more complicated story than they were just out to get Armstrong. But as I was doing some of this research in the Jack Popley scrapbooks that are from his years at WOR and the early days of FM, I found a little poem that I call the Ode to FM. It says, when the thunder rolls and rumbles, FM stills those groans and grumbles. When the lightning snaps and cracks, FM helps you to relax. In a thunderstorm like this, FM brings you silent bliss. Signed, FM. That's it. Thanks a lot. There is a very hard-to-find book by this guy, Gary Frost. I think he wrote it as a PhD thesis. And there's a lot, you can track down the Columbia University Archives, the radio historian website, American Radio History website, a lot of places if you want to dig more into it. Thanks.
Quick announcement, the venue will be serving lunch. It's a new feature of radioactivity. There'll be hot dogs and homemade pork barbecue, and drinks, and will be served in there in the dining room.
I can say if someone has questions or anything.
So that will be there. And another announcement is that the announcement has made about the program. I won't make that yet until I check the call. Okay. If anyone has any questions,
It's hard to have questions. I covered it all so well. Over there?
1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. Here we go.
Mike?
Yeah.
Static is a low-frequency phenomenon. It's due to lightning and all that. HF and above is basically clear. It's just thermal noise, if anything.
Yeah.
So why didn't RCA or somebody tout high fidelity AM at HF?
Well, there were experiments for a few years, I believe around 33, with what they called wideband AM. They went up to those higher frequencies. Not really big. Maybe they've doubled the bandwidth of the regular AM stations. And the end result for static and all is that they still didn't see enough improvement. So all those, there were 3 or 4 experimental stations, Connecticut, the Northeast, and they all gave it up after a while.
Didn't John V.L. Hogan.
Yeah,
still working?
he was another early, I think he had one of the super AM stations.
That was WQXR and,
Yeah, and then
New York.
eventually he went to FM.
yeah.
Apex is, yeah, I've seen that term for it too. And they just, the other problem that they had, the way that was licensed, stations weren't, since they were experimental stations, they couldn't advertise. So they also, once they weren't getting great results and didn't have any funding coming in, that's when, I think a second reason a lot of them dropped out.
I also have another question.
Mhm.
Maybe you covered this, I'm not sure. I couldn't hear very well. Did RCA invent the ratio detector?
Well, it was in their patent portfolio, but the name that came across was assigned to Sylvania.
Okay.
But a lot of those other ones were RCA.
Was that one of the lawsuits that Armstrong had? He thought it was an infringement of his discrimination?
Yeah, that was part of the whole package going against RCA.
Did he win that one, or?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, is that transmitter building at Alpine still there?
It is. Yeah. It's the last I heard, if it was still active, it was some cable television equipment in there.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the small converters that came out and how they were used.
How they were used?
Yeah.
They would normally go into another input into your home radio. Or there were some that retransmitted on an AM signal, but you would lose some of the fidelity you had picked up. So it was more common to hook it through the last audio amplifier. And I guess depending on the radio you had, your radio dealer could do that for you. But the Scott one I know had, some of their models had an input for that converter.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. One of the things I would just like to say is that in my youth, I lived in far west New Jersey and was building receivers and listening to the experimental broadcasts of KE2XCC. And I was using vacuum tubes that were rejected from Western Electric for high transconductance. But the point is that I, somewhere in my archive, still have a station check.
Oh, yeah.
This is KE2XCC, Alpine, New Jersey, experimental music broadcast. We resume our program. And so I had a distant passive participation in this.
Sure.
And when Armstrong went out that building, it was a tragic day for all of us.
Sure was.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. I remember in about the mid-'60s, when I was about 10 years old, my parents listened to the hi-fi. And my father would jokingly say that FM doesn't mean frequency modulation, it means fine music. And he said AM doesn't mean amplitude modulation, it means awful music. So I've never forgotten that, but I am curious. Some years after that, the FM bands just became inundated with rock music, country music, all the things that weren't there in maybe 1965, for example. So I'm just wondering if you are familiar with that and when that change occurred.
Yeah, it was another thing that gave a boost to FM, but it did it, I think, because the big money that was controlling AM didn't see the hippies that were listening to WNEW in New York or something as enough of an audience there to take over their AM station. So the AM stations stayed with what was the most popular at the time and most money-making. So, yeah, that's what ended up filling, and that shifted from the few classical listeners, and now it's down to where, like in New York, there's no in New York City classical station, I don't believe anymore. There's one, WQXR is in New Jersey, owned by Public Radio. So it was a matter of it all, the money changing hands, shifting everything around.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
A quick announcement here. We're back to our original schedule, so Paul Hart will be up talking about tube testers at 1:30, and Randy Warren will talk about assembling a budget hi-fi system at 3 o'clock, and lunch is being served as we speak. See you this afternoon.